a wedding, a day of promise, of devotion, of two lives intertwined in love. It is meant to be a joyous occasion, a celebration of unity. But in the quiet streets of Flint, Michigan, love gave way to something far darker. A groom steps into the driver's seat. A best man stands in the glow of headlights. The roar of an engine shatters the night, and then a sickening impact. When the dust settles, one man lies motionless on the pavement. The newlyweds are gone, not on their way to a honeymoon suite, not to a place of warmth and laughter, but into the cold embrace of a manhunt. Tonight, we unravel a crime as shocking as it is tragic. A wedding night turned into a crime scene. A bride and groom bound not by vows, but by handcuffs. What could drive a man to commit murder on the very night he vowed to cherish life? The town of Flint, Michigan is no stranger to hardship. Once a hub of industry, it now bears the scars of time. Worn streets, quiet neighborhoods, a place where people know each other's names. On the night of August 30th, a wedding was meant to bring a spark of joy to this city. Two young lives joining in matrimony, surrounded by family and friends. A moment of happiness, a day to remember. The groom, James Douglas Shira, was just 22 years old, a man with his whole life ahead of him. He had met Savannah Nicole Collier not long before they decided to wed. Their relationship, marked by youth and passion, had moved quickly, perhaps too quickly. But love, as it often does, can be blind to the weight of time. Savannah, 21, was described by those who knew her as outgoing, eager to start a life with the man she loved. Their wedding was simple, unpretentious. No grand ballrooms, no extravagant displays. Just close friends, family, and a gathering at a local pizzeria. A celebration stripped of luxury, but not of meaning. And among those gathered that night was Terry Lewis Taylor. At 29 years old, Terry was no stranger to responsibility. A father of three, with a fourth child on the way, he carried the weight of fatherhood with pride. Those who knew him spoke of his warmth, his easy laughter, his love of fishing, of open waters and quiet mornings where the world seemed at peace. Terry's fiancée, Nikki Robinson, was waiting for him at home. They had dreams, plans, a future yet to be written. But as the night wore on, Terry would not make it home. He had been more than just a guest that evening. He had been chosen as a groomsman, a symbol of trust, of brotherhood. To stand beside the groom, to witness his vows, to mark the occasion as one of significance. But trust is fragile, and by the end of the night, it would be shattered beyond repair. It had been a long day, one that began with vows exchanged under the August sky, the weight of commitment heavy in the air. James Douglas Shira and Savannah Nicole Collier stood before friends and family, two lives officially entwined. Their wedding was modest, yet it carried the same anticipation, the same joy as any other, a day meant to mark the beginning of something new. As the sun dipped below the Michigan skyline, the celebration moved to a local pizzeria in Flint. It was a gathering of loved ones, a simple reception where laughter and music mingled with the scent of food. The newlyweds were surrounded by those closest to them, including Terry Lewis Taylor, the groomsman who had stood beside Shira just hours earlier, a trusted friend, a familiar presence. Inside, the air was warm with conversation. Glasses clinked together in toasts, voices rising and falling in animated exchanges. Guests leaned in, sharing stories, reliving moments, basking in the joy of the occasion. Plates were passed, hands reaching for slices of pizza, the room alive with celebration. James and Savannah sat together, their hands intertwined. The couple had made it through the wedding, through the chaos of planning, the rush of the ceremony. Now this was the moment to breathe, to enjoy. But in the far corners of the room, there were whispers. Not all was well between the groom and the groomsmen. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. The first signs were subtle. A tense exchange, a quick glance between James and Terry, a pause in the conversation that came just a second too late. Something unspoken hung between them. Then came the raised voices. A conversation that had started with warmth turned sharp, jagged. It was no longer the light-hearted banter of friends. The words between James and Terry carried weight. No one knows the exact moment when the celebration soured, but those in attendance would later recall a heated argument unfolding near the entrance. Some say it was a personal dispute, a matter left unresolved from the past. Others suggest alcohol had played a role, loosening tongues, heightening emotions. Perhaps it was an issue that had long been simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to ignite. But what is certain is this: what began as words would soon turn into something far more dangerous. Terry stood firm, his expression set, unwavering. He was a man known for his loyalty, his dedication to family and friends. But on this night, that loyalty was not enough to shield him from what was to come. The air outside the pizzeria was still. The night stretched over Flint, Michigan, in its usual quiet, punctuated only by the hum of distant traffic, the occasional chirp of a passing car alarm, the low murmur of conversation from patrons stepping outside for a breath of fresh air. A wedding reception had drawn to an uneasy close, but for Terry Lewis Taylor, the evening had not ended. He had left the building moments earlier, his footsteps echoing softly against the pavement, his breath steady, though the argument inside still clung to him. His mind was elsewhere, turning over the heated exchange, the sharp words spoken with no room for resolution. A streetlight flickered above, casting a dim glow over the near-empty lot. A few parked cars remained, their owners still inside, unaware of the events unfolding just beyond the restaurant's doors. Terry pulled out his phone, perhaps to check the time, perhaps to type out a message that would never be sent. Then, a sound, distant at first, then closer, the low, guttural rumble of an engine, steady, deliberate. Terry looked up. Headlights cut through the darkness, piercing and unwavering, growing larger with each passing second. The vehicle was approaching at speed. At first, there was no reason to believe it was anything more than a car leaving the parking lot, a coincidence, a departure like any other. But then, it did not slow. Terry's body tensed, his mind catching up to the moment an instant too late. The screech of tires split the silence, a surge of motion, and then impact. The force of the collision lifted Terry off his feet, his body striking the hood before rolling violently across the windshield, shattering glass, distorting metal, before being thrown onto the unforgiving asphalt below. The sound was sickening, a heavy, unnatural thud. Then stillness, then a voice, a sharp inhale from a bystander who had stepped outside just in time to witness it all. The first to react was a young woman, standing near the entrance of the pizzeria. Her breath caught in her throat, her hands rising instinctively to her mouth. Another patron, a middle-aged man, rushed forward, his footsteps hesitant at first, then quickening as his mind registered the reality before him. Terry's body lay motionless in the street. A pool of blood began to form, spreading outward in thin, jagged rivulets along the cracks in the pavement. His right leg was twisted unnaturally, his arms splayed at odd angles. The force of the impact had shattered several ribs, left deep gashes along his forehead and arms, and caused severe internal injuries that no one could see but everyone could sense. A voice rang out, a panicked cry. "Call 911! Someone call 911!" Another bystander pulled out a phone, fingers trembling, pressing the digits with frantic urgency. The dispatcher's voice was calm, measured, trained for moments like this. 911, what's your emergency? The words tumbled out, fast, disjointed. A man, he was hit. A car, he's not moving. There's blood. Oh my God, there's blood everywhere. The dispatcher's voice remained steady, guiding the caller through the steps. Is he breathing? The man hesitated, stepping closer. He crouched beside Terry, watching, waiting. Nothing. Then, the faintest movement. A shallow, uneven gasp. He was still alive, but his body was failing. A woman knelt beside him, whispering something, though the words were for no one but him, a plea, a prayer, a desperate hope that the ambulance would arrive in time. The distant wail of sirens broke through the night, growing closer, a red and blue glow bouncing off the buildings, reflecting in the glass windows of the pizzeria. Within minutes, paramedics spilled out onto the scene, their movements swift, practiced. A stretcher was lowered, hands pressed to wounds, voices exchanged in clipped urgency. One paramedic placed 2 fingers to Terry's neck, feeling for the faint rhythm of a pulse. It was weak, slipping. We need to move him now. They lifted him with careful precision, placing him onto the stretcher, strapping him down. An oxygen mask was secured over his face, though no one could be sure if he was aware, if he could still hear, if he could still feel. The doors of the ambulance slammed shut, locking him inside. The sirens flared once more as the vehicle pulled away, racing through the city, the urgency of life hanging by a fragile thread. Inside the pizzeria, The celebration had ended. The guests who had once raised their glasses in joy now stood in stunned silence, piecing together the fragments of what had just unfolded. The bride and groom were gone, and Terry Lewis Taylor was fighting for his life. For a few hours, James Douglas Shira and Savannah Nicole Collier were ghosts. The streets of Flint carried no sign of them, no hurried footsteps, no hushed whispers of a panicked couple seeking refuge, only the faint hum of distant cars, the flickering of traffic lights, the rhythm of a city unaware of the violence that had just unfolded. Inside the pizzeria, the last guests of the wedding reception stood in uneasy silence. The music had stopped, the joyous occasion reduced to a memory now tainted by blood on the pavement. The news traveled fast. A man had been run down, left for dead, and the ones responsible were gone. The call had already gone out. Police dispatchers, speaking in steady tones, relayed the information. Be on the lookout for a white SUV. Suspects last seen heading westbound. Possible hit-and-run homicide. It would not take long for law enforcement to connect the names. The groom, the bride. Two people who had pledged their lives to each other only hours earlier, now bound not by vows but by their shared flight from justice. A search had begun. Somewhere in the night, James Shira gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. The SUV carried the weight of its crime, the faint scent of burnt rubber still clinging to the tires, the glass of the windshield fractured from the moment of impact. Beside him, Savannah sat rigid, her breath uneven, her fingers clenching the fabric of her dress. They had not spoken much since they fled the scene. There were no words that could undo what had been done. No explanations that could erase the sight of Terry Lewis Taylor's body hitting the ground, his blood dark against the asphalt. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed, though it was impossible to tell if they were near or far. James's mind was moving fast. Where could they go? To his knowledge, no one had seen them leave. No one had chased after them. No hands had pounded against their windows as they sped away. But the truth had a way of catching up. The weight of the moment pressed against them both. The adrenaline that had fueled their escape was fading, replaced now by something colder. They could not go home. That much was clear. Instead, they headed for a back road, away from the glow of streetlights, away from the familiarity of places they knew. The road stretched before them, empty, vast, leading nowhere and everywhere all at once. Inside the car, Savannah finally spoke. "What do we do now?" Her voice was small, fragile, not the voice of a newlywed bride, but of someone grasping at the last strands of control. James did not answer. The SUV carried them forward into uncertainty, but the law was already moving. Back at the scene of the crime, officers had arrived, methodical in their work. Evidence was being gathered, witnesses interviewed, camera footage pulled, and soon a name was spoken. James Shira. A few hours earlier, he had been a groom. Now he was a suspect in a murder investigation. A bolo alert, be on the lookout, was issued. Patrol cars spread out across the city. Major roads were watched, back roads scanned, but James and Savannah had escaped into the night. Still, no one can truly disappear. Somewhere along the way, their escape had faltered. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps it was the weight of what they had done settling deep into their bones. Perhaps it was inevitable. By morning, they had been found. It was not a dramatic chase, not a final act of defiance. There was no barricade, no desperate standoff. Instead, there was surrender. When officers arrived, James Shira and Savannah Collier were quiet, subdued, their eyes hollow with the realization that their time had run out. The cuffs were placed on James first. Click, click, a bride and groom bound in steel. James was led away, his face a mask of vacant disbelief. Savannah followed, her white dress now rumpled, her hair tangled from the long night spent running from the inevitable. In the cold light of day, they were no longer newlyweds, no longer a couple celebrating the beginning of a shared life. They were prisoners of their own choices, and justice was waiting. The courtroom was silent, a space where time seemed to move more slowly, where every breath, every rustle of paper, every shifting chair carried weight. At the front, beneath the gaze of the judge, sat James Douglas Shira, the groom, now a defendant in a murder trial. Beside him, Savannah Nicole Collier, the bride, no longer in white, but in prison-issued orange, her expression unreadable, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The charges were clear. For James Shira, second-degree murder. A crime not of premeditation, but of intent. A moment where anger overcame reason, where a decision had been made, irreversible and fatal. For Savannah, accessory to a felony. A charge that asked the question, what role had she played? Was she simply a passenger in the car that took Terry Lewis Taylor's life? Or had she known? Had she been a willing accomplice? The courtroom held its breath as the judge spoke. How do you plead? James did not hesitate. Not guilty. His voice was steady, the words spoken with certainty. A claim that would soon be tested. Savannah's turn came. A brief pause, a glance toward her attorney. Not guilty. A formality. The process had begun. Now the law would decide their fate. In the days that followed, the prosecution painted a picture of a man whose emotions had overtaken his judgment. A groom who, in the span of hours, had transformed from a husband to a killer. James had been behind the wheel. He had seen Terry standing there. He had pressed his foot to the gas. This, the state argued, was not a mistake. This was murder. Witnesses were called. Those who had been inside the pizzeria that night. Those who had stepped outside heard the argument, seen the white SUV speed into the darkness. Then the evidence. Surveillance footage. A shaky clip, grainy, distant, but clear enough. A figure walking toward the street, headlights appearing suddenly. Then, impact. An expert took the stand, a forensic investigator. He described the force of the collision, the trajectory of Terry's body as it was thrown, the likelihood that a driver could have mistakenly hit a pedestrian. The answer was clear. This was no accident. The jury listened. Their expressions impassive, unreadable. Then came the turn for the defense's argument. But James Sherrod's attorneys had their own story to tell. A tragic wedding night gone wrong. An argument had escalated. Tensions had run high. Alcohol had been consumed. A moment of panic. Not murder, but a terrible mistake. They pointed to the lack of premeditation. No plans, no evidence that James had intended to kill Terry before that night. And then, the most important question of all, could he have meant only to scare him? The defense suggested hesitation. A split-second decision. Had James truly meant to take a life? Or had he acted out of impulse, only to realize too late what he had done? For Savannah, the argument was even more delicate. Her attorney spoke calmly, firmly. What could she have done? She had not been the driver. She had not been in control. Had she even known what James was going to do before it happened? Was she guilty of aiding a crime, or simply guilty of loving the wrong person? The jury sat in silence, absorbing each word, weighing the gravity of the choices made that night. Now, it would be the law's turn to decide. For the family of Terry Lewis Taylor, no sentence would ever be enough. A father was gone. A man who had loved fishing, who had loved his children, whose life had been cut short on the very night he was meant to stand beside a friend. For James and Savannah, the weight of the law was closing in. In the end, the night of their wedding had not been the beginning of a life together. It had been the beginning of their reckoning. The weight of loss is never carried by one person alone. It spreads, moving through families, through communities, through the hearts of those left behind. In Flint, Michigan, the death of Terry Lewis Taylor was not just a news headline. It was a wound, a fracture in the lives of those who loved him. At home, in the quiet spaces where his voice once filled the air, his fiancée, Nikki Robinson, sat in silence, staring at the phone that would never again light up with his messages. His chair at the kitchen table, empty. The scent of his cologne still lingering on a jacket left draped over the back of the couch. For their children, the concept of forever had been rewritten. Their father had left that night for a wedding, an ordinary evening, a celebration. He had kissed them goodbye, promised to be home soon. But home was a place he would never return to. In the days after his death, Nikki turned to the only thing she could control, the desperate plea for help. A GoFundMe page appeared online, the words raw, unfiltered, written by a woman who had lost not just her partner, but the foundation of their family. We are trying to give him the burial that he wanted and deserves. He was an amazing person. So many people love him. This was completely unexpected, and a lot of lives are affected by this loss. Her words, simple yet devastating, carried through the community. And the community responded. Donations arrived in small waves at first, then larger ones. Messages of support flooded in. friends, strangers, people who had never met Terry, but who understood the depth of Nikki's pain. No amount of money will bring him back, but we just want to do right by him. The weight of grief extended beyond the walls of his home. At his favorite fishing spot, where he once cast lines into the still water, his absence was felt. The rippling of the lake, undisturbed now by his laughter, a stark reminder that some voids can never be filled. At work, his co-workers struggled to comprehend that his voice would not greet them in the morning, that his stories, always told with animation, always shared with warmth, had ended. And then the wider community. People who had known him in passing, those who had seen him ride his four-wheeler down the back roads, who had waved to him at the store, who had heard the way he spoke about his children with pride. His name became one spoken in hushed tones at local diners, in grocery aisles, at church services. A man taken too soon. A father stolen from his children. A life that should not have ended that way. And in the courtroom, his family sat through every hearing, through every legal proceeding, waiting for justice, waiting for the truth to be acknowledged. But no sentence would bring Terry back. No prison term, no courtroom ruling could undo what had been done. At his funeral, the church was full. People gathered, some speaking, some unable to find the words. A friend stepped forward, his voice steady yet heavy. Terry was the kind of man who would give you the shirt off his back. He didn't deserve this. A child cried softly in the pews. The pastor spoke of healing, of remembering the good, of holding on to the love Terry had left behind. But outside, as the hearse pulled away, as the first handfuls of dirt were placed onto the casket, the reality settled in. Terry Lewis Taylor was gone. A father, a son, a friend, a man whose life had been cut short in the most violent way imaginable. And for those left behind, the question remained, why? Why did that night have to end in blood? Why did a wedding celebration turn into a crime scene? And what, if anything, could bring peace to those who had lost him? The air in the courtroom was heavy, thick with the weight of decisions that could never be undone. The case had been argued, the witnesses had spoken, the evidence had been examined. And now, the moment had come. All eyes were on the jury, 12 individuals who had been tasked with determining the fate of James Douglas Shira and Savannah Nicole Collier. The judge turned toward them. Has the jury reached a verdict? A pause. Then a nod from the foreperson. A folded piece of paper was passed forward, handed to the clerk, then to the judge. James Shira sat still. His hands rested on the table before him, though his fingers curled slightly, betraying the tension that ran through his body. Savannah's gaze was fixed ahead, unblinking. The courtroom was silent, a space where the finality of words carried more weight than the steel of handcuffs, more weight than the bars of a prison cell. The judge unfolded the paper. He read. Then he spoke. On the charge of second-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. A murmur swept through the courtroom, a wave of whispered reactions, some expected, some filled with quiet disbelief. James Shira did not move. His shoulders did not rise or fall in reaction. He simply sat, absorbing the truth of what had just been said. For Savannah Nicole Collier, the decision followed. On the charge of accessory to a felony, we find the defendant guilty. There was no outburst, no dramatic protest, no cries of injustice, only the quiet, the steady hum of reality settling in. They had entered the courtroom in the hope that somehow the events of that night could be reframed, that the choices made in a single moment could be softened, explained. But the law had spoken. The sentencing would come soon. James Shira faced the possibility of life behind bars. For Savannah, the punishment was lesser, yet no less defining. She would not leave the courtroom as a free woman. Across the room, the family of Terry Lewis Taylor sat in silence. They had come seeking justice, but justice does not restore life. It does not fill the empty chair at the dinner table. It does not replace the father taken from his children. The legal process had reached its conclusion. The pages of court records would hold the names, the dates, the verdicts. But outside the courtroom, time did not stop. For James Shira, there would be decades of confinement, a life reduced to cold walls and scheduled movements, to time measured not in experiences, but in the slow, unchanging pattern of prison life. For Savannah, there would be time behind bars, followed by a life forever marked, not as a bride, not as a wife, but as a woman whose wedding night had ended in the worst way imaginable. Every case holds lessons about choices, consequences, and the fragile line between life and tragedy. These are the stories that demand to be told, the ones that reveal not only the crime, but the people left in its wake. If you want to hear more real-life cases, if you want to explore the truth behind the headlines, subscribe now. There are more stories to uncover, more voices to be heard. Hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and never miss our next video.